What happens when one of Hollywood's most straightforward and intensely physical action stars finds himself seated across from one of daytime television's most outspoken and unapologetically blunt hosts? Normally, such encounters pass by. Like any other promotional interview, friendly smiles, light jokes, a few questions about the latest film, and then everyone moves on. But on that particular morning, something entirely different unfolded. What started as a routine television appearance slowly turned into a tense and unexpected exchange that left the studio audience stunned and viewers at home talking for days. If you think you've seen awkward celebrity interviews before, this one pushed the boundaries of what anyone expected to happen on a daytime talk show. Before we get into the details, imagine the situation for a moment. A global action star, known for his no-nonsense personality and physically demanding roles, walks into a studio expecting the usual routine. The lights are bright, the audience is clapping, the cameras are rolling, and the hosts are smiling. Everything appears normal on the surface. Yet beneath that polished television atmosphere, a completely different kind of conversation is about to begin, one that neither the producers nor the guest fully anticipated. That morning, Jason Statham arrived on the set of The View expecting what most actors experience during press tours, a comfortable promotional chat about his newest movie. For years, Statham had built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most recognizable action stars. From high-speed chases to intense fight scenes, his career had been defined by adrenaline-filled roles that thrilled audiences worldwide. His appearances in blockbuster franchises like the Fast and the Furious series had cemented his image as a tough, relentless screen presence. Interviews usually followed a predictable pattern: questions about training routines, behind-the-scenes stories from action scenes, and maybe a humorous anecdote about filming with co-stars. But as soon as the conversation began, it became clear that this interview would not follow the usual script. Across the table sat Joy Behar, one of the most outspoken hosts on the show. Known for her sharp wit, political commentary, and willingness to challenge guests directly, Behar rarely shied away from controversy. While other hosts often kept conversations light and friendly, Behar had built a reputation for asking the kinds of questions that could make celebrities uncomfortable. The moment the cameras started rolling, she leaned slightly forward in her chair with a familiar half-smile that longtime viewers recognized immediately. It was the look she often wore just before delivering a pointed remark. "So, Jason," she began, her tone casual but clearly loaded with criticism, "I have to ask about something that's been bothering me for a while. Your movies are basically just violence porn, aren't they? When are you going to make something that actually has substance?" The question hung in the air like a sudden thunderclap. For a split second, the energy in the studio shifted. The rest of the panel seemed caught off guard by how quickly the conversation had turned confrontational. Whoopi Goldberg, seated nearby, shifted slightly in her chair as if unsure whether to jump in or let the discussion continue. Sarah Haynes glanced sideways at the others, clearly sensing that the tone of the interview had taken an unexpected turn. Meanwhile, Sunny Hostin adjusted her posture, watching the exchange carefully. Guests on The View were usually welcomed warmly before any serious discussion began. But this time, the conversation had jumped straight into criticism before Statham had even finished settling into the interview. Despite the abrupt attack on his work, Jason Statham didn't immediately react with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he maintained the calm, controlled demeanor that fans had come to associate with him. Leaning back slightly in his chair, he raised one eyebrow, a subtle gesture that suggested both surprise and quiet confidence. "Well, Joy," he replied in his unmistakable London accent, his voice steady and measured, "I think that's a pretty narrow view of what I do." His response was calm, but it carried a quiet firmness that made the audience lean forward with interest. "These films employ thousands of people," he continued. "They entertain millions of audiences around the world. And at their core, many of them tell stories about loyalty, family, and standing up for what's right. I'm not sure how that qualifies as what you just called it." For a brief moment, it seemed like the conversation might return to a more balanced tone. Statham's answer had been thoughtful rather than confrontational, offering a defense of action films without attacking anyone personally. But Joy Behar wasn't ready to let the point go. Leaning forward again, she folded her hands and spoke, with the slightly condescending tone that critics and fans alike had come to recognize from her many years on television. "Oh, please, Jason," she said, shaking her head lightly. "Let's be honest here. Your characters mostly just drive fast cars and punch people. Where's the art in that?" The comment landed sharply, drawing a mix of nervous laughter and uneasy silence from the audience. At that moment, the atmosphere in the studio became noticeably tense. What had begun as a routine promotional appearance was rapidly evolving into something far more uncomfortable and far more unpredictable. The other hosts exchanged quick glances, clearly aware that the conversation had crossed into dangerous territory for a live daytime show. Meanwhile, Jason Statham remained composed, but the subtle shift in his posture suggested he was now fully engaged in the debate. He was no longer simply promoting a movie. He was being asked to defend an entire genre of filmmaking and the career he had built within it. And as the cameras continued to roll, everyone in the room seemed to realize that this interview was about to go much further off script than anyone had planned. The atmosphere in the studio had already grown tense, but the conversation was far from over. What had started as a simple promotional interview had now transformed into a deeper and far more uncomfortable debate about entertainment, responsibility, and the influence of films on society. The cameras continued rolling, the studio lights remained fixed on the hosts and their guest, and the audience could sense that this moment was becoming something unusual for daytime television. Joy Behar leaned forward again, clearly unwilling to let the discussion fade away or change direction. Her expression showed determination, and there was a sharpness in her voice as she continued pressing her point. "Where's the social commentary in your films?" she asked. "Where's the deeper message? Don't you think someone with your level of fame and influence has a responsibility to use their platform for something more meaningful?" Her question carried a mixture of criticism and challenge, as if she was daring her guest to justify his entire career in front of a live audience. Before the situation could escalate further, Whoopi Goldberg attempted to gently guide the conversation back toward calmer territory. As one of the more experienced moderators on The View, she had seen plenty of heated moments before and knew when a discussion risked going too far. "Joy, maybe we should," she began, raising her hand slightly in an effort to redirect the conversation. But before she could finish her sentence, Jason Statham spoke up. No, it's fine," he said calmly, lifting one hand in a small gesture that signaled he was willing to continue the conversation. His voice remained steady, but those watching closely could see a subtle change in his body language. His jaw tightened slightly, a small but noticeable sign that Joy's remarks were beginning to affect him. Still, he kept his tone controlled. "I'm actually curious," he added, leaning forward a bit. "I'd like to hear more about Joy's perspective on what counts as meaningful entertainment." The comment sounded polite on the surface, but there was a quiet challenge hidden within it. It was clear he wanted to understand the standard he was being judged by. Joy Behar seemed more than happy to elaborate. "Well, for starters," she said, her voice carrying a confident edge, "maybe something that doesn't glorify toxic masculinity, the tula." Words echoed through the studio. She continued speaking, clearly convinced that she was making an important point. "Your characters are always these hyper-macho men," she said. "They drive fast cars, fight people, and solve every single problem with their fists. Don't you think that sends a terrible message? Especially to young boys who grow up watching these films and thinking that's what being a man is supposed to look like." As she finished speaking, the entire studio seemed to fall into an uneasy silence. The audience, which normally reacted with applause or laughter during the show, now sat quietly, unsure how to respond. Even the camera operators, professionals accustomed to dramatic television moments, appeared to sense that the tension was steadily building. On the side of the set, Jason Statham's publicist sat watching the exchange unfold. Her expression showed clear concern. Promotional interviews were supposed to help a film's publicity campaign, not turn into confrontational debates about cultural values. At that moment, she looked as though she wished she could simply disappear from the room. Back at the table, Jason Statham repeated Joy's phrase slowly, almost as if he were carefully examining it. "Toxic masculinity," he said, his voice noticeably lower than before. He paused briefly, letting the words settle before continuing. "That's an interesting criticism," he added calmly. especially coming from someone who's built an entire career attacking people on television. The remark hit the table like a sudden jolt of electricity. Joy Behar's eyes immediately flashed with irritation. "Excuse me?" she responded sharply, clearly taken aback by the directness of his reply. "I think you're confusing holding people accountable with attacking them." Jason didn't raise his voice, but his response came quickly and with clear confidence. "Is that what you call it?" he asked. His tone remained controlled, yet the challenge in his words was unmistakable. Spending 20 minutes tearing apart someone's life's work without even knowing the first thing about what actually goes into making those films? The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The other hosts now looked increasingly eager to calm the situation before it escalated further. Sarah Haynes quickly leaned forward, hoping to steer the conversation toward a safer subject. "Maybe we should talk about the stunts in your new movie, Jason," she suggested with a polite smile. "I heard you perform most of them yourself, which is pretty incredible." It was a clear attempt to redirect the discussion back to the film he had originally come to promote, but Joy Behar wasn't ready to move on. "Oh, I know plenty about your movies, Jason," she said firmly, turning back toward him. Her voice carried a tone of certainty, as though she believed her criticism was fully justified. "I know they make billions of dollars selling the fantasy that every problem can be solved with violence," she continued. "I know they promote harmful stereotypes about what it means to be a man." She paused briefly before delivering her final point. "And I know that intelligent actors like you could choose to do better." The remark hung heavily in the air. By now, the tension in the studio had reached a level that was impossible to ignore. Even viewers watching from home would have been able to sense how uncomfortable the conversation had become. Jason Statham remained seated calmly, but his body language told a different story. His hands were now tightly clasped together in front of him on the table, his fingers interlocked as though he were carefully holding back a stronger reaction. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched across the studio, making the situation feel even more dramatic. Everyone in the room seemed to realize that the next thing he said could determine whether the conversation calmed down or exploded into something far bigger than anyone had expected when the interview first began. The tension in the studio had now reached a level that was impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. The bright studio lights, the rolling cameras, and the quiet audience all created an atmosphere that felt heavier with every passing second. What had started as a typical promotional appearance had now turned into a serious confrontation about art, entertainment, responsibility, and respect within the entertainment industry. The camera operators, trained to capture every important reaction, slowly zoomed in on Jason Statham. The close-up shot revealed subtle details that viewers at home might not otherwise have noticed. His shoulders looked slightly tense, the muscles tightening beneath his jacket. His breathing had changed as well, slower but deeper, as if he were carefully controlling his emotions while choosing his words. The studio audience watched quietly, sensing that the conversation had reached a delicate point. Jason finally spoke. "Intelligent," he repeated softly. His voice was low, almost reflective, but the weight behind the word was unmistakable. "That's quite a compliment," he continued, glancing briefly toward Joy Behar before returning his gaze to the horror. "But it's interesting hearing that from someone who just suggested that action films have no artistic value, and that the millions of people around the world who enjoy them somehow can't tell the difference between entertainment and reality." His tone remained calm, but the firmness in his voice had grown stronger. The audience shifted slightly in their seats, reacting to the growing intensity of the discussion. Some people exchanged glances, unsure whether the conversation would cool down or continue escalating. Joy Behar quickly leaned forward again, clearly unwilling to let Jason's interpretation of her comments stand unchallenged. "I never said the fans were stupid," she replied quickly, raising one hand in emphasis. "Let's be clear about that. What I said was that the movies themselves are irresponsible." Her voice carried a defensive edge now, as if she felt the need to clarify her earlier criticism before it was misunderstood. Jason nodded slightly, acknowledging her response, but he didn't appear convinced. "Right," he said, his voice becoming a little firmer. "So the problem isn't the audience," he continued. "It's me, because I choose to make films that people actually want to watch." He paused for a moment before continuing, his tone still controlled but noticeably sharper. Instead of making extremely pretentious art house films that maybe 12 people see in a tiny independent theater somewhere. A ripple of nervous laughter spread across part of the audience, though it quickly faded as the tension returned. Across the table, Sonny Hostin recognized that the conversation was rapidly turning into a direct argument between the guest and one of the hosts. Wanting to calm the situation before it spiraled further, she leaned slightly forward and attempted to offer a more balanced perspective. "I think what Joy is trying to say," she began carefully. But before she could finish her sentence, Joy interrupted sharply. "I can speak for myself, thank you," she snapped, keeping her eyes fixed on Jason. Her response made it clear that she had no intention of letting anyone soften or reinterpret her words. The studio once again fell into an uneasy silence. Joy straightened slightly in her chair and continued speaking, her tone confident and unwavering. "What I'm saying," she explained, "is that actors of your caliber have choices." She gestured lightly toward Jason as she spoke. "You have influence, you have fame, you have the attention of millions of people around the world. With that kind of platform, you could choose to make films that challenge audiences, films that make people think, films that address real social issues." Her voice grew slightly more intense as she continued outlining her argument. "There are so many stories in the world that deserve attention, stories about inequality, justice, politics, human struggles, and cultural change. Movies can be powerful tools for starting conversations about those issues." She paused briefly, before delivering her final point. "But instead," she said, "you take the easy money and keep making the same kind of mindless action movie again and again." The words landed heavily in the room. The audience remained silent, sensing that the discussion had now crossed into openly personal criticism. Jason Statham sat still for a moment, listening carefully. His hands were still clasped together on the table in front of him, his posture steady but clearly controlled. He didn't interrupt while Joy spoke, allowing her to finish her point completely. From the side of the set, the production staff watched nervously. Interviews on The View were known for lively discussions, but this had turned into something far more intense than the usual debates. Even Whoopi Goldberg, who had seen countless heated moments during her years on the show, seemed to be waiting carefully before stepping in again. The atmosphere in the studio now felt almost electric. Everyone, hosts, audience members, and crew, could sense that Jason was preparing to respond. And judging by the steady look on his face, it was clear that whatever he said next would not simply end the conversation. Instead, it might push the debate even further, forcing everyone in the room to confront a deeper question about entertainment, art, and what audiences truly want from the stories they watch on screen.